Good morning to everyone, and welcome to the Western Library here in the University of Oxford for the culminating day of this wonderful conference we've been having, Jesuits in Britain celebrating 400 years. And it's been an extraordinarily rich, intense academic conference. We've covered everything from the 16th century to the present day. We've been as far afield as Guyana and South Africa, and we've covered topics as diverse as the arts, Jesuits and women, and intellectual activity. And the lecture this morning will be given by Professor Gerard Kilroy, who's a senior research fellow at Campion Hall, and he'll be talking about the early Jesuit mission in England, lingering doubts. My name is Nick Austin. I'm the Master of Campion Hall, so on behalf of Campion Hall and all the conference organisers, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here, especially those who are joining us today specifically for this lecture, and the ecumenical service in Christchurch Cathedral that we'll be having afterwards. After the lecture, there'll also be, as well as chance for a few questions for Gerard, there'll also be a panel trying to sum up something of what we've been exploring in this very rich period of 400 years and more of the Jesuits in Britain. I want to make a special thank you here to the staff of the Bodleian Library. We've been given this gratis, so this wonderful theatre here in the Western Library, so many thanks for that. And the exhibition staff have been very generous in helping to organise this wonderful display, which includes Edmund Campion's own copy of the Summa Theologia with his own annotations. And those of you who are online, joining us online, can find Edmund Campion's copy of the Summa in the Bodleian's digital archive. So if you can't be here in person to see it, you can see it online. I'll now hand over to Michael Barnes to introduce this session.
Good morning. If I've counted correctly, this is session number 28. And I've been chairing the lot. The last one, the last final lecture by Gerard Kilroy. Gerard is Professor of English Literature at the Academia Ignatianum in Krakow. He's Senior Research Fellow at Campion Hall here in Oxford, and he's an Honorary Research Fellow at University College London. His recent publications include Edmund Campion, A Scholarly Life, 2015, an edition from the manuscripts of the Epigrams of Sir John Harrington, 2009, and Edmund Campion, Memory and Transcription, 2005. His edition with the assistance of Tom McCoog of Evelyn Waugh's Edmund Campion was published in 2022. Gerard, you've always got more thoughts on Campion, and we look to you for further enlightenment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here in the Western Library, where I've spent many happy hours. My nervousness, I think, about today is that many people in the room know much more about Campion than I do. So I'll try and say something new about him. I'm very influenced by the work I've been doing with a wonderful team on Cardinal Poole, the exhibition of his books in Lambeth Palace Library, which is shortly to open. And it gave me a different perspective on Campion, which I've tried to incorporate in this talk. Well, that's the first hitch. Let me get that. Oh, sorry, I was pushing it the wrong way. Thank you, yes, I got it. When Campion set sail for Flanders in late June 1571, Robert Parsons tells us he left England for good and all. He arrived at Dr. Allen's new college at Douai just as all Libri Octi of Nicholas Sanders' De Visibili Monarchia, issued from John Fowler's press in Louvain and endorsed the 1570 bull of excommunicating the Queen. The 500 folio pages of Book 7 presented the history of the Civitas Dei in contrasting columns, with the Civitas Diaboli, heretics, crammed between Pontifices Romani and Doctores Catholici. It was a book loathed by the Privy Council and still cited in the execution of justice in 1584. Campion and all captured priests in the mission of 1580 were interrogated, as a particular declaration tells us, on 4 passages from the end of Book 7, and on 3 passages from the book always known as Bristow's Motives. Richard Bristow was Allen's principal assistant at Douai. The 6 articles put to the priests on the rack all focused on Regnans in excelsis, whether the papal bull was lawful, whether the Queen was lawful, whether Sander and Bristow had taught a truth or a falsehood in supporting the Pope's right to depose the so-called Queen of England, Praetensa Angliae Regina, whether the Pope had power to authorize the Northern Rebellion, and finally, whose side they would be on, the Queen or the Pope, in the case of invasion. There is no evidence that Campion bought a copy of De Visibili Monarchia, still less annotated it. From his trial, we know that he disagreed with the papal bull and he recognized the Queen as his lawful queen. What he did buy and annotate at Douai was a copy of Plantin's new edition of the Summa of Thomas Aquinas on the 13th of August, 1571. This is on display outside. Since its foundation in 1568, a congenial group of Oxford men had gathered at Douai. Edward Rishton, Thomas Stapleton, Thomas Dorman, Thomas Ford, and Gregory Martin, his former contubernalis, roommate, and lifelong correspondent. Henry Holland, Noster Hollandus, who wrote a poem eulogizing Campion, joined sometime in 1573. Yet after only 18 months at Douai, during which he took all 3 parts of a degree in theology, Campion set out in February 1573 on a solitary pilgrimage to Rome. This was a radical departure, especially as it's clear that Campion hated leaving anywhere. Why did he leave, and what did he leave? Sanders' book certainly endorsed the papal bull of 1570, praised the Northern Rebellion of 1569, and maintained the central tradition established by Cardinal Poole. Allen was later to portray moderation as the norm at Douai, with the exception only of what he called 2 learned men of great zeal and excellency indeed, Dr. Sanders and Dr. Bristow. Yet Allen himself, as Eamon Duffy argues, repeatedly defended the validity of the bull and as early as 1572 actively sought its armed implementation. Simpson, with studied understatement, talks of a divergence between Campion's views and those of Dr. Allen. Campion's decision to leave the centre of the English mission where Allen's duplex or twin-track policy was already evident has to be read as a rejection. So Campion left the intellectual and political hub of the English mission and walked alone, mendici peregrinatoris habitu, to Rome in 1573, where, as we now know, Sander was working on the manuscript of what Duffy calls the most influential account of the English Reformation ever published. And the date is very misleading. The date says 1575 of the printed edition, but this is something that Sander had finished working on in 1573. And I think this is, it's only recently that people have been analysing the manuscript, and which is in the English College, and seeing where it had got to, where Sander had got to at this point. Sander seems to have reached the reign of Mary and Edward in the third book of De Origine et Progressu Schismatis Anglicani, when he left for Spain in November 1573. After Sander's death, Edward Rishton edited the manuscript, and for the 1585 edition extended it into the reign of Elizabeth in Book 4. After Rishton himself died in 1585, it was expanded further by Robert Parsons, William Allen, and John Hart for the 1586 Rome edition. The book sold all over Europe, running through 6 Latin editions and 9 translations. More than 600 copies in 19 different countries are extant. It's not hard to account for its popularity, since it represents in colourful detail Henry's divorce and remarriage as driving his claim to supremacy over the Church, while printing in full the bull of excommunication and deposition. There were some 20 derivative works, including 2 editions of Girolamo Pollini's Historia Ecclesiastica della Rivoluzione d'Inghilterra. This is the copy which is at Exeter University Library and was annotated extensively. They're the biggest, it's the most annotations in any of Topcliffe's books, and they're long annotations. And this is in 1595, and it's fascinating to see that the issues of the 1530s are still hot topics in 1595. The Queen asked the Duke of Tuscany to suppress the first edition of Pollini's Historia Ecclesiastica in 1591, and 1 copy of the second edition was seized by Richard Topcliffe and annotated by him, as you see here. Topcliffe's annotation trace all Sander's traitorous libels, including the story that Anne Boleyn was Henry VIII's daughter, to Nicholas Harpsfield's, a treatise on the pretended divorce, which remained in manuscript until printed by the Camden Society in 1878. Topcliffe was able to pin down the source since, as he boasts in the margins of Pollini's Index, in 1582, I did take him, Carter, and he was executed for his publishing and selling diverse traitorous books, amongst which was Dr. Nicholas Harpsfield's book, of which he sold written copy, manuscript, for £20 a copy. And out of one of these written copies sent to the traitor Cardinal Allen, this false and traitorous history, i.e. the Pollini Sander, was compiled and written. Harpsfield's approach was in turn shaped by Cardinal Poole's open letter to his royal cousin ad Henricum VIII Britanniae regem pro ecclesiasticae unitatis defensione, normally known as De Unitate. Poole began this in Padua in September 1535, when he had recovered from the shock of hearing of the deaths of the Carthusians, Fisher, and More, and sent it as an open letter in 1536 to his cousin, the king. He writes very movingly of how he'd been able to do nothing for a month when he heard the news, and then he began this incredibly powerful piece of writing. when he'd recovered the shock of the deaths of these people. Could you have killed Fisher, he says? Could you have killed Moore? Could you have conceived such a great crime? Could you have admitted such a disgrace? Though I myself was not present when these events took place, as I think about them now, they come into my mind as some terrible dream. While the first part carefully demolishes Henry's case for a divorce, the last 100 pages rage in a fine rhetorical apostrophe first to England and then to London, with indignation and anguish at the death of Thomas More. Although it was printed in Rome by Anthony Bladus in 1539, few copies of this are extant in England, where the first printed edition to survive in any number is the Ingolstadt edition of 1562. Invisible as it has been in print, the first complete English translation was in 1965, Poole's seminal interpretation, as Duffy calls it, shaped Catholic historiography of the English Reformation and determined the primacy of Thomas More in English Catholic martyrology. In 1557, Nicholas Harpsfield completed the manuscript life of Thomas More, clearly intended to accompany the publication of William Rastall's The Works of Sir Thomas More. Duffy argues that Harpsfield could hardly have undertaken this task without Poole's knowledge and support, indeed without Poole's commission. It's well known that William Roper provided Harpsfield with a first-hand memoir, and that Harpsfield and Rastall, More's nephew, were part of the exiled household of Thomas More in the house of Antonio Bonvisi in Louvain. Less well known is the fact that all three, Roper, Rastall, and Harpsfield, were in 1557 working for Cardinal Poole in senior legal or administrative roles in Kent. Rastall's own life of More survives only in a fragment which describes the deaths of John Fisher, the 3 Carthusian priors, and the torture of the second group of 3 Carthusians. Harpsfield's life of More was not printed till R.W. Chambers edited it in 1932. So, writes Duffy, Sander established the fundamental Reformation narrative for Catholics. You might say, he says, the Catholic myth of a Reformation triggered by a tyrannical king's lust for a scheming courtesan. Harpsfield had already introduced the charge, which Sander elaborates, that Anne Boleyn was the illegitimate daughter of the king. And Sander elaborates it in a quite sort of sensational way, it has to be said. And Michael Questier says that this Sander's Reformation history written by the Daily Mail. Promulgated in full the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis, absolving English Catholics of their allegiance to the Praetensa Angliae Regina. There you can see the full text of the bull published in the second edition. When Campion arrived in Rome at Easter 1573, he was asked by Cardinal Gesualdi what he thought of the papal bull, and he replied that it procured much severity in England and the heavy hand of Her Majesty against Catholics. One wonders whether the Cardinal asked him if he knew Sander's work and what response Campion gave. The apparent invisibility in print of Poole and Harpsfield leaves Sander looking like a maverick outsider, a strident extremist who died alone in Ireland. Yet, he was firmly in the centre of the tradition established by Poole, continued by Harpsfield, and after his death by Rishton, Parsons, and most importantly, by Allen. These men represent the English Catholic mission. It's Campion who's usually presented as the princeps gregis of Elizabethan martyrs, who is the outsider. What his Rationes Decem does not say is as significant as its 8,000 words. It says nothing about Anne Boleyn, the royal divorce, the royal supremacy, papal excommunication, or Elizabeth's illegitimacy. Elizabeth is simply Regina Angliae, or Regina Potentissima, whom he begs to be dignam ingenio, dignam litteris, dignam laudibus, to join the great princes of Christendom. The adversaries in the Rationes Decem are not Henry VIII, Cranmer, with his wife in a suitcase, and the Praetensa Angliae Regina, but the European reformers, Luther, Calvin, Beza, and Melanchthon. When Pope Gregory XIII agreed to the English mission on the 28th of September 1579, the Jesuit Superior General Everard Mercurian organized a meeting with his assistants, where Allen presented the arguments for Jesuit leadership of the mission, and Robert Parsons, as a Diaboli Advocatus, presented objections. The most important anxiety was that the mission would be perceived not as made for matter of religion, but as some practice of state. In the end, Mercurian approved Allen's mission, but expressly willed the missionaries not to meddle in politics, but to confine themselves to ministering the sacraments. 10 days later, the spy Sled reported that there was a dinner in Rome where Dr. Allen, this is his words, thundered out in speech the arrival of Dr. Sanders in Ireland. On the 17th of July, 1579, Sander had landed in the Bay of Dingle with 40 armed men, 8 priests and friars, and had processed along the shore under a papal banner. On the 4th of December, 1579, Mercurian wrote to Campion telling him to go to Padua. The following day, Allen also wrote to him enthusiastically to say that a letter from his superior would soon reach him. My father, brother, son, Edmund Campion, make all haste and come, my dearest, as quickly as you can to Rome, preferably by the middle of February. In mid-January, the Austrian provincial, Henrik Blissem, wrote to Mercurian to say how difficult it would be to replace Campion as a lecturer when he was halfway through the course, but that he would write to his rector. On the 6th of February, 1580, Mercurian wrote again to Campion, worrying that his first letter had not arrived and telling him now to go straight to Rome. On the 12th of February, Blissem wrote again to Mercurian to tell him how much the college would miss Campion. All who know his virtue, his powerful eloquence, and his other talents are affected by his loss. On the 18th of March, Mercurian sent a further letter telling Campion with increasing urgency to go straight to Milan. There appear to have been at least 9 or 10 letters telling Campion to Campion from his superiors. There appear to have been, but no letter from Campion. This suggests that Campion was reluctant to leave his flourishing academic and pastoral ministry in Prague, and that his rector and provincial, sensing that he was a man in crisis, were trying to protect him. New evidence supports this hypothesis. 2 of Campion's philosophy students were Caspar Brinsky and Adam of Anorsi. Their notes on Campion's lectures on Aristotle's logic and physics were recently found in the Prague Castle Metropolitan Archives. Luckily, before I'd finished my books, I was able to go and see them, and wonderful. I went again last week to look at them. At the beginning of the notes on logic, Vinotier explains that Campion, on leaving Prague, asked for a copy of his students' notes as a memorial of his work. Vinotier prepared his notes on the physics, while Caspar Brinsky's notes on logic came to him, he says, on the latter's death. In both volumes, Vinotier added headings, marginal decorations, and verse. We know from these notes that Campion told his students at 1 p.m. on Saturday the 9th of February, they recorded the exact hour, that he had been summoned to Rome. So distressed were they by this news that they dramatized their grief in Latin hexameters. 100 of them. Complaining that their professor was leaving before finishing the course. When Campion countered by emphasizing that, like Aeneas, he was not going of his own will but had been summoned, inde vocor, vocor inde, they pressed home their emotional advantage. And you can see this halfway down the right-hand page. Pater, infligis corde quae vulnera nostro. Father, what wounds you inflict on our heart. In his letter to his rector Campani from Bologna, Campion wishes he had been able to write to them individually, singulatim, but overwhelmed by the number and various anxieties, I've ended up satisfying no one. Leaving was clearly an emotional wrench for everyone. Campion offered his distressed students the consolation of a public disputation, for which the playbill has survived. And you can see halfway down the names of Caspar Brinsky and Adama Vanossi among the contestants there. It's a very interesting reflection of pedagogy in this period, that a disputation was regarded as a sort of holiday event. And this is in the Strahov Library in Prague. On Saturday, the 23rd of February, Vanossi, after leaving several pages blank, begins a new section, explaining that Father Paul Neucker gave the next lecture after Campion was summoned to Rome and sent into England. Below, he adds a prayer to Campion on the verso, and I find this very, very moving, and you can see it on the bottom of the left. Sancti Martyre, memento Adama Vanossi, discipuli quondam tui, once your pupil. The notes have now become a written memorial of the words of a martyr, a sort of tertiary relic. Prince Ferdinand of Bavaria took Campion in his carriage on the first stage of his journey from Prague to Munich, where Campion seems to have spent nearly 2 weeks in the Duke's library, making notes on early editions of Luther and preaching on the feasts of Thomas Aquinas, the 7th of March. The Duke then laid on his carriage to take him to Innsbruck, from where Campion began walking like a pilgrim again to Padua. Here he received his letters telling him Romam propera, hasten to Rome. So he finally took post horses and reached Rome on the 10th of April, 4 months after he had been summoned. Johannes Schmidl, the historian of the Bohemian province, wrote that he lingered for a little while. Aliquantisper haerebat. If Campion's hesitant progress to Rome suggests doubts about the mission, the meeting of the missionaries and the assistant Oliver Manetz with Pope Gregory XIII identify the source of those doubts. And we know very well about these thanks to Tom McCoog and his team looking at the secret Vatican archives. In 1580, in advance of a meeting with Gregory XIII, the missionaries submitted 19 written questions. The papal answers in the secret Vatican archive acknowledge that great harm, magnum damnum, has befallen English Catholics as a result of the bull, and that the context in which there was hope of recovery of that realm by that way and manner, ea via et modo, an incredible euphemism for armed rebellion, has vanished, evanuerit. Yet the Pope did not repeal the bull. Instead, the notorious mitigation was inserted into the faculties granted to the missionaries that rebus sic stantibus, as things stand, Catholics need not obey the bull. The execution of justice cites the bull from the extract in Sanders de Visibili Monarchia and includes the text of the mitigation, which it derides as meaningless. It did nothing to mitigate the perception of the missionaries as agents of deposition. Campion exhibited so hearty aversion from meddling, Parsons' words, that he asked not to be made superior. So Parsons was put in charge. The original party of 12 was joined by Thomas Goldwell, the last Marian bishop who had ordained Sander, and Dr. Nicholas Morton, who had been involved in the rebellion of the Northern Earls. On the 18th of April 1580, this formidable party crossed the Tiber by the Ponte Molle, and took the old Via Francigena, even though it was raining heavily. Campion insisted on wearing old buckram under an old cloak and was frequently stuck in the mud. When challenged, he simply said that to him that went to be hanged in England, any kind of apparel was sufficient. They reached Reims on the 27th of May, where Dr. Allen announced that he had fresh letters from Spain with news that Dr. Sander had landed in Ireland. Parsons says that both men were horrified by the news and did easily foresee that this would be laid against us and other priests that would be taken to England. Campion went to the president, Mr. Dr. Allen, and said, "Well, sir, here now I am, as you have desired my going to England, and I am come a long journey, as you see, from Prague to Rome, and from Rome to Reims. And do you think my labours in England may countervail all this travail, as also my absence from Bohemia, where though I did not much, yet was I not idle, nor unemployed, and that also against heretics." Compare this with Allen's letter to Campion, "Come quickly," and so on. In Reims, Campion ran headlong into what Peter Lake and Michael Questier call the unwelcome political and polemical context. Allen's apparent duplicity and the meddling forbidden by Mercurian forced Campion to confront the material realization of the mental doubts that, like evil spirits, had followed him from Prague. The etymological root of dubitare is duo habere, a frequentative form of it, to oscillate between two views. Campion's lingering doubts were not about the binary choice between Her Majesty and the Pope, but whether ministry and preaching were possible on the darkling plane between the state's rack and the oppositional ecclesiology of Harpsfield, Sander, and Allen, fatally wrapped in Regnans in Excelsis. Confronted in Reims by Allen's duplicitas, he fell back on his vow of obedience to his Jesuit superior with the gay abandon of a condemned man. Campion finished his interview with Allen by saying, "I made a free oblation of myself to His Divine Majesty for life and death, and I trust that He will give me grace and force to perform, and this is all I desire." The ultimate cause of the confusion of spiritual and temporal power lay with the first act of supremacy passed in November 1534, making the king and his successors the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England. More, Fisher, the Carthusians, and all subjects subsequently were forced to choose one of two. The source of this awful choice was Henry VIII, the man who, in Campion's own words, it's one of the fiercest things he ever said. He saw an inscription in the lodge of Christchurch, where some of us have just been staying, which welcomed Elizabeth as the daughter of the founder of the college. And Campion said, "I've never seen anything miserious, more wretched than a man, the memory of an outstanding man, Wolsey, being forgotten, and this honor being conferred on a man who has, in his words, completely confused the human and divine and destroyed root and branch both religion and the monarchical commonwealth of Britain." Sander and Campion were acting out two alternative conceptions of the church and two distinct resistance theories. Campion had used both his visits to Rome to voice his disagreement with the papal bull, as he asserted vehemently at his trial. He added that he had answered the Queen herself, that he had acknowledged Her Highness not only as my Queen, but also as my most lawful governess. "I acknowledged Her Highness as my governess and sovereign. I acknowledged Her Majesty both facto and jure to be Queen." Campion seems deliberately to echo the wording of the 1559 oath, which required the subject to acknowledge that the Queen's Highness is the only supreme governor of this realm. he remains resolutely silent about the second half of the sentence, as well in all spiritual or ecclesiastical things or causes, as temporal. Urged to the point of supremacy, he said indeed they were bloody questions. When Campion landed at Dover on the 25th of June 1580, Sander had been in Ireland for a whole year, and musters had been raised in every county in England. As the Spanish ambassador reported, there was vigilant watching day and night from the beacon towers. On the 19th of July, 1580, the day Campion wrote his letter to the council, the famous brag, Viscount Baltinglass stirred Leinster into revolt. Indeed, on the 21st of August 1580, Mendoza reported that fear of a rising of Catholics here, as well as in Ireland, had prompted the Queen to order 100 Catholic gentlemen to be imprisoned in various castles and strongholds. Sander's expedition to Ireland, like a blanket, suffocated the English Jesuit mission, robbing it of the air it required to live and breathe. The proclamation against Jesuits of January 1581 explicitly states that Her Highness, therefore, foreseeing the great mischief that may ensue by such wicked instruments, whereof experience hath been over lately seen in the realm of Ireland. It's a remarkable feature of Catholic historiography that the first English Jesuit mission has been analysed and assessed with barely a reference to Dr. Sander. Parsons, in his Life of Campion, makes only 3 passing references to Sander's expedition. Bombino follows his lead. This has shaped all subsequent Catholic historiography so that the damaging effect of Sander's expedition has been expunged from this Campion story. The invasion was no sideshow, but the stage on which the first English mission was unwillingly played and the prism through which it was negatively viewed. Michael Carafiello's influential essay characterizes the mission as fundamentally political, but makes no mention of the invasion of Ireland. Robert Scully mentions it only in a footnote. Paul Hanmer transposes the militancy of the Irish invasion to the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits, he says, sought to foment rebellion against Elizabeth and prepare the way for a foreign invasion to restore Catholicism by force. The Society of Jesus has been blamed by the Privy Council and modern historians for intensifying the state's oppression of Catholics, when the blame lay with the narrative established by Paul, endorsed by Allen, and enacted in glorious technicolor with book and sword by Sander. Patrick McGrath's verdict. I'm sorry, I missed one slide. Patrick McGrath's verdict still seems just. Allen, like the Pope who relied so much on his advice in English affairs, failed to see that he could not have it both ways, and that he was placing the missionary priests in an impossible situation when he sent them to work for the Catholic cause by spiritual means, while at the same time he was supporting attempts to overthrow the Protestant regime by force. If, as Eamon Duffy argues, Allen cannot entirely be absolved of responsibility for the disasters of Catholicism in the 1580s and 1590s, we are forced to ask whether Campion was so compromised by the papal bull, Allen's duplex aims, and Sander's militancy that the first English Jesuit mission must be considered a failure. The traditional answer is to turn to the transformative grace of martyrdom. But I wish first to consider the impact, human and spiritual, Campion made in the 388 days he spent in disguise and in secret preaching and administering the sacraments from Berkshire to Yorkshire. This was a life of passionate pastoral ministration intended by his superior. Campion's famous letter to Mercurian in November 1580, a letter that was intercepted, reveals how dangerous it was and how desperate Catholics were for comfort. Although the Latin text shows Campion at his most self-deprecating, the quotation from Psalm 118 that ends this letter reveals how keenly he felt the danger. I ride through some part of the county almost every day. The harvest is altogether immense. As I sit on my horse, I meditate my little sermon, and once I have entered the house, put the finishing touches to it. I speak with all those who come up to me and hear those who wish to confess. In the morning, I say Mass and then preach. They listen intently, like men thirsty for the word. Very many receive the sacraments. We cannot long escape the hands of the heretics, since all around us are so many spying eyes, so many wagging tongues, so many traps of our enemies. I wear a completely ridiculous outfit, which I change as frequently as I change my name. I myself read letters which announce on the first small page that Campion has been captured. This chant has now become so familiar wherever I come and so rings in my ears that fear itself has taken away my fear. Anima mea in manibus meis semper. My life is every moment in danger. Henry Moore found that in the north, 80 years later, in 1660, the memory of Campion's preaching had been passed down. Moore writes that his audience included young men of notable families who would camp out in neighbouring barns to hear Campion in the morning. The 4 sermons, still remembered, all on passages from Luke's Gospel, focused on God's mercy and the human response. The Annunciation, the healing of the 10 lepers, the parable of the talents, and the Last Judgment. They were not merely captivated by his eloquence or elocution, Moore says, but by the warmth with which he spoke and some hidden force in his way of speaking, which, as it was believed, proceeded from nothing less than the Holy Spirit. He preached every day, except when he had to withdraw from the throng of besiegers in order to write. This would mean, I calculate roughly, that while he was at liberty, Campion's words reached some 30,000 to 50,000 people. 2 eyewitness accounts, one by the spy who portrayed him of his last sermon at Lyford Grange, agree that Campion combined 2 passages from Luke, where Christ, vividly aware that his own death is to come soon, weeps over Jerusalem, which Campion identified with England. Lamenting the obduracy of the city that kills its prophets and reminds them that he would have gathered the children of Israel as a bird doth her brood. Everyone, Campion, the 2 priests, the nuns, laity, and the informer, was weeping. This Mass left a powerful legacy among the congregation. I apologize for the quality of the next slide. And Edward Keynes and his wife Catherine of Compton Paunceford were among those arrested at Lyford Grange, and you can see them in the top left of this handmade chart. Over the next 100 years, 7 of their descendants became Jesuits, among them Alexander Keynes, who went on to describe what we heard about the other day, the brutal execution of 5 Jesuits caught up in the Popish plot, in a book owned and annotated by John Maynard Keynes. I did all this work for Brendan Walsh because his wife, Laura Keynes, is from the Keynes family. When in the 1650s, Mary Cotton of Warblington Castle was led by the Duchess of Newcastle into the Carmel in Antwerp, dressed rather incongruously as a nymph. She joined 9 of her cousins, Anne and Catherine Keynes, and you can see all these on the bottom, the middle line, Anne Keynes and Catherine Keynes, and then right along the bottom line, you can see the others, Anne and Mary Harcourt, and 5 Wakeman sisters. Altogether, 15 descendants of this couple, who had been at Lyford Grange, entered convents in Antwerp, Gravelines, Rouge, and Kent. Even in the Tower, Campion could win over a hostile audience, as he did in the first disputation. When the lieutenant of the Tower derided Campion's declaration that he was spent and almost exhausted with pain and miseries, and asserted that he was tortured only because of his wicked conspiracies, Campion hauled himself to his feet and, with a countenance all inflamed, offered to accept any torture if anyone could charge him with a single crime. A deep silence ensued, says Bombino, even amongst the lords themselves and the whole assembly. The silence in Elizabethan audiences is an incredibly rare event. And after that, no one contradicted him. Later that day, they tried to raise a chant that he could not read Greek, which Campion ignored until he was passed a copy of St. Basil. When he read this perfectly and translated it elegantly, the crowd gave up hissing and jeering and, Bombino says, turned instead to what his translator calls a festival and soothing murmur. When he arrived for his trial at the doorway of Westminster Hall, and this is the last trial, I think, to take place there, and I put this to give you some idea of what it must have felt like to be a prisoner or defendant in this huge space, which is now used for wonderful ceremonial speeches like Benedict XVI and so on. Campion was held up by the huge crush of people. So he entered the immense packed hall a little after the other defendants. All eyes turned to him, says Bombino, as if a new planet had appeared. Bombino writes that his arms and hands had been so completely dislocated after 2 more rackings that he was only able to respond to friends in the hall surreptitiously greeting him with the characteristic serenity of his face. When he finally reached the bar, he was applauded by many, and all the other defendants bowed deeply to him as if to a prince. So how does one explain this impact? One could start with Campion's appearance. Although we have no contemporary portrait and no description, one feature recurs in all the accounts. He is described as riding to greet the Queen in Oxford in 1566 with a remarkably serene expression and composed demeanour. When he was being taken as a captive to London, all were struck by the modesty of his countenance. He entered the Tower with singular not only constancy but even cheerfulness. During the first disputation, he spoke with a serene and settled countenance. On the scaffold, the beauty of his eyes and the cheerfulness of his face moved all who saw him, and he spoke with constancy in his expression and speech. But I wish to suggest that there was something else that made Campion's appeal irresistible. In his sermon on the protection of Our Lady, he twice refers to nostrae fragilitate, our frailty, and all the accounts of the responses to Campion suggest a strong sense of his physical frailty. The Oxford contemporary who met him on the road to Rome was surprised to see him dressed like a beggar and taking the pilgrim road, because he knew him to have a body of the constitution none of the strongest, non robustissimum. Behind Campion's own fear of torture may lie an awareness of this. He and Robert Parsons spent 2 days and nights in prayer talking about Alexander Bryant's torture and how they should react under torture. One senses it too in the way the congregation of Lyford wept during the last sermon, vividly aware of what suffering awaited him. Mrs. Yates' maidservants followed him from Lyford, weeping and wailing most pitifully. Or the young Berkshire horseman who followed him to the gate of the Tower and then went home and wept. The combination of spiritual strength with physical and emotional vulnerability is evident in all the accounts of his appearances after torture in the Tower and Westminster Hall. In a marginal gloss in the Pollini copy that we've talked about earlier, owned by or annotated by Topcliffe, Topcliffe has written, as you see in the left-hand margin, in this incredibly calligraphic script, and Edmund Campion was a foundling, and for that reason to be reputed as filius populi, and was brought up in an hospital in the city of London. Campion was not a foundling, but fatherless by the age of 12. Topcliffe intends his jibe to be pejorative, but I think he unwittingly selected a central feature of Campion's being. Mayors and London aldermen lined up to act as patrons of this orphaned prodigy. This is a man who, even on the scaffold, asked those of the household of the faith, the phrase that stuck in Evelyn Waugh's mind, to pray with him the Symbolum Apostolorum. Campion harnessed his vulnerability as an orphan to his devotion to his fellow men and women. As a result, he won not just a captivated audience, but devoted followers. Thomas Ford, the former Fellow of Trinity, was described by Bombino as Campiano addictissimus. He was clearly not the only one. After Christ's Hospital, Campion was always at home in large groups, whether in St. John's, the novitiate in Brno, the 12 missionaries walking to England, or the 7 men printing the Rationes Decem in the attic at Stoner Park, or writing to Our Wigsy, Our Holland, Noster Hollandus, Noster Martinus, his contemporaries at St. John's, with whom he remained in correspondence all his life. As Parsons says of him, he was of a singular good nature, facilimi ingenii. Campion had something which touched others and changed their lives forever. He stayed for only 3 weeks in Mount St. John in Yorkshire while writing the Rationes Decem, and so inspired the young William Harrington that he twice went abroad to become a priest and came back the second time to say Mass in the room of Henry Dunn, John Dunn's brother, in 1593, where he was arrested. Harrington wrote from prison to the Lord Keeper, John Puckering, "Campion I desired to imitate, whom only love for his country and zeal of the house of God consumed before his time." Harrington was executed with spectacular brutality on the 18th of February, 1594. Even the Queen was charmed, and one can see why Campion would have been reluctant to condemn Elizabeth as praetensa Angliae regina. It was only a few years earlier in Oxford when the Queen had sent the Earl of Leicester to offer Campion unlimited patronage. "No one would believe what a care she hath to pleasure and prefer you, insomuch that I am commanded to ask what you would have her do for you or any of your friends. Make use of her royal generosity, knowing that you've been safely taken under her protection and may expect, day by day, more and more benefits." On his way from Ireland to Douay, Campion dedicated his Histories of Ireland to Leicester, remembering his several courtesies at Oxford, how oft at the court, how at Rycott, how at Windsor you have not ceased to further with advice and countenance with authority the hope and expectation of me, a single student. Bombino adds, in a marginal gloss to his own copy in the Borgo Santo Spirito, on the night before the arraignment, Campion was led to the Queen, covered with the cloak of a servant of Owen Hopton, lest anything should disturb those who did not know what was going on, and that in her presence and that of Cecil, he talked much about religion, as did the Queen herself, and that he was tempted with the offer of an archbishopric and the hope of other prizes. Parsons confirms that Campion said in public at the trial that he had spoken to the Queen and made it clear that once again the topic was the bull. When Lord Charles Howard asked Campion which queen he prayed for on the scaffold, Campion answered, "Yea, for Elizabeth, your queen and my queen, unto whom I wish a long, quiet reign with all prosperity." And the effect of that is that when Howard got back to the court, this is Parsons' account, the Queen asked him where he'd been. He said he'd been in the execution of 3 papists, and she said, "Well, what's your opinion of them?" And he says, "Well, I think they've all been put to death for no fault." One wonders what was her face at that point. When the news of his death reached Prague, Philip de Monte, the Kapellmeister, sent music on the first 4 verses of Psalm 136, Super Flumina Babylonis, to William Byrd, but with the verses pointedly rearranged, so that the second verse, with its suggestion of hanging up their harps, comes last. Byrd responded by sending back a setting of verses 4 to 7 as Quomodo cantabimus, how shall we sing in an alien land? So that de Monte's despair and Campion's lingering doubts came to be replaced by defiance and determination. Long after the death, he anticipated so clearly. This is, by the way, one of the real treasures of Campion Hall. This is an incredibly large and very unusually large Agnus Dei, and it was founded in 1959 by workmen working at Lyford Grange. And the only priest there at that point who'd been in Rome was Campion. So, if you were a detective, I think you would say it's pretty likely to be Campion's. It's also must have been very heavy and uncomfortable to carry. So only someone like Campion would have carried it, I think. It's on display, isn't it, outside today. His preaching, spoken, written or printed, and the memory of his ministry, his teaching and his hilaritas continued and continue to leave us, in Seamus Heaney's words, speechless and renewed. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. As magnificent in scope as it was moving in tone. Thank you so much. We have a few minutes to raise some questions or thoughts from the floor. Let's go straight on, use what time we've got. Just a moment to settle. At the back there, Joby.
You described Cardinal Allen as having a duplex intention. Do you think he was duplicitous? Because he gets a good press in Catholic circles.
Yeah, this is a very, very good central question. I mean, I think he, as you say, I think it's not just that he gets a good press, but he is sort of central to the Catholic story of the Reformation. I mean, 471 priests sent into England. And then the figures of those who were executed and those who died in prison, somewhere in the mid-hundreds, from 116 to 150, something like that. But there have been critics. I mean, the OD&B article by Eamon Duffy, and Eamon Duffy's chapter in Reformation Divided on Allen, I was quoting from those. Patrick McGrath, as I say, I think in a very, very balanced account in Papists and Puritans. It's an old book now, but it's a very, very good book. I think I never find anything when I go back to it that's odd. So I think, I mean, what your question highlights is, I think, the need for somebody to do a biography of Allen. And I can see why people hesitate, because it's like, we were talking this morning at breakfast about Dunkirk. It's as if, this is part of the national myth, and Allen is part of the national Catholic myth. So I think your question is a very, very good one and very difficult one to answer. But I can't, the evidence is so strong. He cannot not have known of Sanders' invasion. And yet he asked Mercurian to send 2 of his best men on the expedition, and apparently didn't tell either them or Mercurian. Yeah. Now, I think it's inconceivable. I mean, I know Sled is not a reliable witness, he's a spy, but it fits what we know had happened. And I think what's a shame about the way the history of Sanders' expedition has been written is, in a way, they played along with Allen's account that it was, surprising news he'd landed there. But, an expedition like that takes some time to put together, even one as badly organized as that. And then to sail from Spain to England. So I hope that answers your question. I mean, I think it's a very, very central question you've raised.
Anybody? Nick?
This is perhaps wandering off the topic a bit, but Robert Southwell's On Humble Supplication, would you read him as following in the footsteps of Edmund Campion rather than Allen in that respectful address to Her Majesty, rather than an antagonistic relationship which Parsons himself in his publication after the increased persecution, if I remember correctly, was much less temperate?
Yes, well, I almost want to ask Peter here to say, knows more about the humble supplication than I, but I do think that Southwell's more in the Campion tradition and the Campion camp, if you like, than in the other side. I mean, his whole approach is much more ironic. Yes.
As the century moved on, did the narrative change at all, particularly in relation to the Popish plot and the development, it seems to me, of a new form of literature in the scaffold speeches of the martyrs and the Popish plot? Did they embrace the story of Campion in any sense, particularly the Jesuit martyrs? In that, but there may have been other English Catholic narratives which somehow muted or changed, that transformed the place that you've given Campion.
Well, I can only answer from sort of very narrow base here. I mean, this is obviously a huge topic, isn't it? And I mean, I'm very struck by the way in which the Campion story goes on being passed around in manuscript. So, you know, the manuscript, many people here know English poet B5, comes from Wootton Wowen, and we've got a latest date in it of 1657. And there is the poem about Campion, Why Do I Use My Paper, Ink and Pen, copied out again, circulating. And my impression is that goes on, and the devotion to, as it were, to Campion and the other martyrs, was Southwell's poetry, is in the same manuscript, 32 poems of Southwell there. So I think they appear, yes, as model martyrs. And what I think is difficult for, I sense, for Catholics in the middle of the century, and then even more in the 1670s, is that the effect of the gunpowder plot. And so this idea of armed rebellion, ea via et modo, I mean, I think it's, you know, I'm sort of speculating while doing this talk, how different would it have been if there hadn't been the papal bull? And yet, as soon as you say that, you say, well, then what about the rebellion of the Northern Earls? What about Mary Queen of Scots arriving in England? I mean, it's the whole, and then the Rodolphi plot. I mean, I think it's, you know, obviously I've been working on Evelyn Waugh, and he portrays it as the plots as an endless plot of Cecil himself, Burghley, but it's clear that some of them were plots, and obviously they have a very bad effect on the lives of Catholics in the country. But I think it's, I mean, my sense, I don't know what others think, is that these two coexisted. I mean, the reasons for the oppression and the heavy fines and the gradual grinding down. And I think it's very interesting what happens to people under oppression. And I've been reading quite a lot at the moment about families under German and Russian oppression in Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, you've got these extraordinary things where people are protecting, say, Jews for a year, and then suddenly handing them over. So the same person who protects them becomes the person who hands them over. And I think it's made me realize that under oppression, people are not constant. for all sorts of very, very humanly understandable reasons. But I'm sorry, I'm strayed a long time.
One more. Tom?
First of all, it's very good to see that you're up and about.
Thank
We're
you.
relieved after last night. This is a question, mere alternate history or fantasy or what if. But John Bossy, in his article on Robert Parsons, The Heart of Robert Parsons, for the Campion Hall volume, raised the question, what if Campion had not been executed and Robert Parsons had been? Would Campion had been able to govern, to administer, to guide the mission? Would it have taken a different direction? I'm just wondering what you would think about that. Your knowledge of Campion, no one can rival that. And you know a lot about Parsons and Allen. Do you think it would have changed the direction?
Well, because this is a fascinating question, especially as Victor's sitting behind you. But I think that I've been thinking a lot at the moment, in the last year, about the 3 books published in 1584 and smuggled into England, and have long thought that that was a concerted campaign by Parsons. Parsons orchestrating a copy of a letter, Leicester's Commonwealth, treatise on the right title of Mary Queen of Scots, Leslie's book, and of course Allen's True, Sincere and Modest Defence. And those are smuggled in, as you know, and cause mayhem, as they were intended to do. But looking at what Mark Rankin and Earl Havens have been looking at, this list of prison books distributed from the Marshalsea on order of Catholics in 1585, the following year, you've got over 600 books, all devotional. And these books are obviously pre-ordered because it says what kind of binding they're to have, what kind of pages, and so on. And they're distributed from the Marshalsea. And they're all lay people. And I wonder whether this is a true verdict of what was happening, that Parsons was still thinking that what you needed to do was to bring down the regime by books. Whereas what the Catholic laity is asking for is, give us some prayer books, some devotional books. Of course, the Christian Directory figures very largely in that, Parsons' contribution to devotional literature. And that may be a simplification, but I think the Bossy essay is fascinating, but I think, it's right at the beginning, he says that, let's look at it the other way around, rather than looking at Campion, the good guy, and Parsons, the bad guy. Let's look at Parsons as prudent and Campion as reckless. Well, I don't think that's a fair characterization either. So I think that he would have done something different, is what I'm really saying. I think he would have, after all, what he did in that year and a bit was preach and minister the sacraments. And that's clearly what English Catholics were desperate for. And all the work that's being done on women in the late 16th, early 17th century, and on manuscripts, I think shows that these communities were desperate for a priest, and when they didn't have a priest, they used hymns and so on. So I think he would have managed it, but I think it would have been very different from this still polemical thing. But that's what I think is why Poole's influence is so important. And the Harpsfield, Topcliffe knew the Harpsfield. There were, presumably that was a treatise on the pretended divorce was circulating widely. And this is a very polemical view of the Queen. Sorry.
Great. Can I ask just a final question? You made a lot about the way in which Campion comes back and he's received by these communities and he encourages them. And yet at the same time, he's saying when he goes back to England, he's going to his death, he knows that. How does he manage to encourage without the sort of doom sense that sometimes runs through his speeches? How does he manage to encourage and yet keep this focus on what he knows is going to come?
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting question. I mean, I think I'm still very struck by Henry Moore's account of the topics of his sermons, the remembered topics. I mean, it's true they're the only ones remembered, but we've got 4 sermons all on Luke, and then the 2 final, the final sermon in Life of Grange is based on 2 passages in Luke, and they're all, it seems to be, about God's mercy.
Yes.
And I get the sense that some years ago I met a monk in La Pierre-qui-Vire in Burgundy who had been sentenced to death twice at the end of the war. He was in an Alsace regiment, and when he was captured by the Russians, they sentenced him to death. Somehow they let him go, and he went back to France and found himself sentenced to death again. And he described waiting for the execution. He heard the other people being led out, and then mysteriously again he was released. So he got on his bike and went to La Pierre-qui-Vire. But he described the sense of freedom that he felt at that moment, sitting in his underclothes and just feeling free. And I get that sense from Campion that okay, he's accepted, it's going to end badly, but in the meantime, there's that hilaritas, is the word used there, serenitas, constantia, those are the 3 words that keep coming through. So I think that's what balances it out, and that's what must have, really captivated people, really, that this was a free man.
Thank you. I think it's a good point on which to finish. We have to move on, Nick. Okay, we'll come back and thank you properly at the end, but let's just stop for a few moments. We're going to have 3 panelists, I think, coming up to share their thoughts on the conference. So, 3 panelists. David.
So there's usually a step here that I'm still on.
Just briefly introduce you, I think. Yes, okay. So our 3 panelists who've been with us at least part of, or most of these 3 days. Dermot McCulloch, hardly needs any introduction, professor in the university here and a fellow of Campion Hall. Susan O'Brien, former principal of Margaret Beaufort Institute in Cambridge. And Damien Howard was provincial of the British Jesuits up until a little while ago, as if he could forget, and is now senior chaplain here. Okay. If I could just cast a mind back to Peter's introduction 3 days ago, where he quoted Abby Warburg and that lovely little saying, "The dear God lies in the detail." And that's been repeated a couple of times during this conference. I thought we might go back to that, because the question I have for the 3 of you, just to reflect upon, is how do you move from the detail to the narrative? And what sort of narrative comes out of some of the details that you've been listening to? In many ways, I think, Gerard, what you've given us has been a classic bit of historiography, where you build a narrative out of a lot of detail, which for people like me who don't know very much about it, I'm picking up all the bits and pieces. I'm trying to make a picture out of this. And the great teacher, the great historian, is the one who can piece it together for us and make a narrative come out of the detail. Does that make sense? Would you like to start, Dermot?
Thank you. Well, what a leading question, the right question, and I certainly didn't prime you on this, because my takeaway from this wonderful week of such riches was to return to childhood when I grew up, son of an Anglican country parson in Suffolk, and spent a great deal of my life in his parish church, a most wonderful medieval building, an absolute textbook of all the things you need to know about an English parish church. And very early on, because I was a bookish child, I realized that there were things I could learn from this building in which I spent so much and many happy hours. It had a beautiful south aisle and porch, the most elaborate part of it, which had been provided by a late medieval rich legal family. It was finished 10 years before Henry VIII's schism with Rome. And the family were called Sulyard, and their tombs were there in this church, St. Mary's, Weatherden. And the interesting thing which struck me about the family was there they were, lords of all they surveyed, literally, but through the Reformation, they went on being Roman Catholics. And they lived in the parish till the last male Sulyard died in 1799, and there was his memorial on the south aisle wall with the significant initials at the bottom of a very conventional Georgian monument, R.I.P. Requiescat in pace. Something you would not have seen on the tombs of his Georgian neighbour in the next parish. They had remained faithful to the old church, and yet they had been the squires still, generous to the parish church, which their ancestors had built. Only this week I looked at a deed signed by this last male Sulyard in the 1770s, in which he was signing as a trustee of the town lands, the parish lands, over to a new set of trustees. He was still integrated in the parish, respected in it, though his ancestor, another Edward Sulyard, had been one of those gentlemen rounded up in 1580 and imprisoned because of the news of Sander and then of Campion. So this paradox delighted me as a child. The sight of monuments, one of whom had been the sheriff who had presided over the burnings of Protestant heretics in the reign of Mary, and then they go on, still celebrated and respected by their fellow villagers, who may not have seen the significance of this oddity. As a result, my very first piece of academic work was an undergraduate dissertation in the University of Cambridge on Catholic recusancy in Elizabethan Suffolk. I cherish the manuscript research that I did there, some of it in the Mount Street archives all those years ago. So that gave me straight away the sense of the paradox of history, the way in which history is never quite what you expected, and that's what's the fascination of it. It's untidiness. As I went on into this undergraduate dissertation, I encountered the name John Gerard, which I encountered again this week in the wonderful lecture that Gemma Simmons gave us on Mary Ward, because John Gerard was not just hiding in one of these Suffolk recusant houses, but he went back to Rome to support Mary Ward later on, a very unpopular thing to do among his Jesuit colleagues. So I began getting glimpses of a wider story, which has remained with me. And one thing which Gerard just said, most poignant, pointing to the paradoxes of human beings behaving in beautiful ways and then terrible ways, sheltering Jews, then betraying Jews, and the way in which human beings can so often just confound our expectations, sometimes in a good way. As I wrote the biography of Thomas Cromwell, who is not a name to be celebrated in this room, I suspect, I've discovered that the chief person who he admired in his life was Cardinal Wolsey. So much so that his coat of arms was based on those of Cardinal Wolsey. And then, in the 1530s, as the Reformation was unfolding, one of his chief friends and protégés was the Lady Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. He really saved her from her father's wrath. In turn, she became godmother to his first son. Paradox is, Cromwell's Reformation, undoubtedly an ideological Protestant Reformation, was configured in the way that Cardinal Wolsey had started his reforms of the church. So this is exactly, I think, the sense in which detail starts you in a place and it broadens out. Back again to Gemma Simmons' paper on Mary Ward, she was asked a question about why only England produced a Mary Ward, that there was no parallel attempt at female emancipation alongside the Jesuits elsewhere. And she gave this wonderful answer. Well, the English recusant community so often had to be a lay community in their activism. They wanted devotional works, and so often they got them. So they learned to do without clergy, and that opened the minds of some women to the fact that they could have an apostolate too. And then Gemma brilliantly leapt us to Korea in the late 18th century, when there was another Catholic new mission without priests. And it was possible, therefore, for the church to flourish in time of persecution without its clergy. So something I take away from this week, which I've enjoyed very much, is the sense of the Society of Jesus as a huge global unifying force. It was there in the house in my father's parish in the 1580s, no doubt, not recorded, but certainly there. And it was there in the end in so many mission fields. Its vision could be so wide. John Gerard ministering to Suffolk recusant clergy and then grappling with a very difficult problem in Rome. So I thank all the speakers this week for enriching my understanding of history.
Thank you, Dermot, for doing the priests out of a job. I'm grateful for that. Susan.
It has been a quite remarkable tsunami of Jesuit Ghana. One of the great advantages, sorry, is it not quite close enough? Okay. For me, one of the absolutely remarkable thing about these very intense 2 days has been the opportunity to look over 400 years. Because very often you don't get that when you've got your little patch as a historian. But to look over 400 years, and then what struck me was what emerges from looking over 400 years as a kind of themes that come through. So this is the detail from particular eras, which then seem to add up to something that you can reflect on. And 2 came out for me. I'm sure that for everybody who was taking part in the conference, the sort of running stream of the spiritual exercises came through very forcibly. In fact, our final paper gave us a wonderful reflection on that in the 20th century. But I was thinking about the many ways in which the significance of the spiritual exercises mattered in all levels of society, different levels of society. So we had the embroidery that came from the fruits of meditation of Helen Winter in the 17th century. We had Alice Bild going about her housework, actually sort of living and enacting the spiritual exercises and what she had made of them, one of these cases that you were referring to. We had printing presses and secret libraries which held the exercises. We had retreats run for convents on the continent. Well, in fact, convents going all the way from 1600. We took it through to 1900. So there was a way in which the sort of renewal and the spring of their life and their activism came from the the spiritual exercises. And so it went on. And it went on into the sort of almost rediscovery, revaluing of the spiritual exercises in the second half of the 20th century. So that if I hadn't had the insight that we got of Milton standing in the Venerable English College, looking at Southwell's poetry, itself a manifestation of meditation on the spiritual exercise, I might have been tempted to think, oh, this is a narrow stream and it gets broader and broader, because where we ended up was the permeation of what's now a minority post-Christian society, but the permeation of the spiritual exercises into other Christian traditions through the retreat movements, through spiritual direction, and that was where we ended up. But because I heard about Southwell, I thought it wasn't always just a narrow stream. Actually, it started out as something much broader. So for me, all that detail added up to this. So this morning, I went onto my phone and I put Pray As You Go on, because it's still being recreated. Now, using modern technology, the Jesuit spirituality, the examen, you can do on your phone, guide you. You can do and this is all English Jesuits reenacting it. So for me, that is a theme. That came through very strongly. I won't go on about the other one, but I have to say I'm labelled it in my mind, Jesuit exceptionalism, English exceptionalism. And I think that's another theme, and I think it's both reality and it's partly becomes memory, and it even becomes something lived out when it's no longer perhaps so valuable. But that's for another time.
Just to interject, that little phrase that came through at odd points, how did the English Jesuits get away with it? Sort of standing outside the mainstream of the society somehow. It was fascinating.
Yes, and it ended up even in Maryland in the 17th century, always wanting a different, can we have a different ruling? Yeah. So it went outside of England too.
Thank you. Damien.
Michael.
Can I let you loose?
I don't think you've got any choice. You've asked me to make a contribution. I'm very acutely aware of not being a historian in this august panel, and I think I've been asked to say something about the detail on the provincial's desk, and maybe some of the gaps that keep that from the history books. So let me say 3 points, of course, about topics that Jesuits would rather not talk about, because I think that's part of the thing here, and I'm probably not going to make any friends by mentioning them. But the first one, prayer. Gosh, everybody's relieved that it's a nice, easy topic. I know we've talked about spiritual exercises at some length, and that's been really important. But Jesuits pray every day, or at least they're supposed to, for quite a substantial period. I think one of the things we often don't talk about is exactly what we are doing during that time. I think it's hedged around by insecurity that we're not praying together like the monks, and we're not great mystics like the Carmelites, so what on earth are we doing? Probably one of the first things I did as provincial was actually try to raise the topic, and it was quite interesting, some of the insights that came out of Jesuits sharing about what goes on for that daily hour of prayer. There was real depth, actually, to be discovered in what was going on there. I don't know whether this is something that the archives can tap into, but I got a feeling there might be spiritual journals and diaries, retreat notes, over centuries, and I got a feeling actually there's a really interesting and important story to be told there. Certainly an awful lot of detail, an awful lot of God's presence and God's support to Jesuit lives taking place in that place. Second topic, not so easy. I'm going to name abuse as a really important topic. I do that partly because I've got in my mind the faces of abuse victims, and I think some of them would be saying, how can you be telling this story, centuries of Jesuit life, in 2023 and not name this reality? I'm sorry if some of you are thinking, gosh, how could he say this, talk about this topic on such a lovely day? I think it's being faithful to our Jesuit spirituality, to be perfectly honest. And I think that's why I make no apologies for this. Ignatius was absolutely clear in the first week of his spiritual exercises that there's no way we are going to acquire the grace of knowing ourselves to be loved sinners and disciples of the Lord unless we first of all confront the darkness and the sin. We're lucky now, in a way that we weren't so lucky 20 years ago, to know that this is not just an issue for us in the Catholic Church, in religious orders. It's a subject that touches on every area of life in our society. So we're not alone. We don't have to be surrounded by the shame that was certainly there for the first few decades. But I think it's really important as Jesuits that we name that and we face that, and we understand that there's a really difficult but important grace being given to us in what's taken place over the last few decades on that topic. And the third really difficult topic, most difficult of all, money. Jesuits, most of us like to imagine that all the things that keep us going, from breakfast in the morning to the computer that helps us to send our emails and engage with academic life and all the other things that make our lives possible, come because of a kind of providential fairy that makes all these things available to us day by day. Whereas if you've spent a couple of years in governance, as I have now, you know that it comes through terribly dull, prosaic, and for English people, English exceptions, some slightly distasteful things to do with money and bank accounts and investments. The British province, I don't think it's a big secret, is fairly well resourced. And that's down to two things. One is fantastically generous benefactors who we ought to name and celebrate as we remember them in our monthly masses. But it's also the story of the really prudent management of resources over a number of centuries. And I think it's really important. You don't have to be a Marxist to see that the mission, all the things that we've been able to do, have at least in part been possible because of the faithful management of those resources. There's a story there to be told. And again, Jesuits, rather not think about that. Filthy lucre.
Can I ask the three of you this question? What's been forgotten in the narratives which we've tried to trace? Susan.
For me, it's the lay brothers. I picked up two mentions of a lay brother. One who faithfully was a sacristan, I think at Stonyhurst, and who faithfully looked after the vestments for 60 years. And then there were lay brothers who were working on the plantations in Maryland, were also mentioned. And of course, in the list of martyrs, Nicholas Owen. But I think there's a story to be told about the lay brothers, which we didn't really hear at all, including, what happens in the 20th century when change happens. But I would very much like to have heard, to hear more about that.
Thank you.
Story.
Dermot.
You put me on the spot. I personally, and this is partly my personal preoccupation, is we could have heard more about architecture, buildings, and their messages, both in England and elsewhere. I think I'm very struck, for instance, visiting Cologne some years ago and looking at the Jesuit church there, which is making clear allusions to the Romanesque architecture of the great parish churches of Cologne. And what it is saying is that we are the historic Church of Germany, not the Lutherans. And they're building this in the early 17th century, by which time Lutheranism looked a very convincing traditional German church. And the Jesuits are saying, no, you're not. We're going to leap back over that. And perhaps we could have had a bit more discussion of that sort of thing. I mean, there weren't the resources for the English community that there perhaps were in early 17th century Cologne. But I think of some of the parish churches which the society created in the mid-19th century. One in Yarmouth, for instance, a stunning piece of recreation of late medieval East Anglian parish church architecture by Scholes, isn't it? And that sort of statement is worth exploring.
Damien? I was going to say something about the ecumenical dimension. Obviously, Dermot's presence here intimidates me significantly on that topic, but there's obviously the relationship with the Church of England has come up again and again in various different ways. But in our own age, there's been a real transformation of that relationship in the post-Vatican II period. I suppose what always struck me as provincial was that we have been of great service to the Church of England in the last 50 years. The number of Anglican students, and indeed from other Christian traditions, at Heathrow, for example, including doing ministerial training, was quite extraordinary. The number of Anglican clergy who come to retreat at St. Bino's is very, very significant. So, again, perhaps that was mentioned while I was out of the room, because I wasn't there for the whole thing, but it seems to me there's a really interesting story to be told there.
So after 26 papers, another, how many?
Another 15, I should
Another 15 or so. Tom, can you manage? No problem. Okay. Do we have to move on?
We do, yeah. So can I thank, first of all, Michael, who has heroically chaired the sessions. This was 26, was it? I can't remember. But with great aplomb and great insight. And many, many thanks, Michael. Thank you so much to Gerard for your wonderful, always new and enlightening material and much food for thought. And thank you to our panelists for such acute and enlivening observations. We're coming to the end now of our conference. We just have the ecumenical service in Christchurch Cathedral now. Those here present, if you can be seated 11:30-ish or soon after, that would be great. We kick off at 11:45. And we have two, as well as William Kenny, Bishop William Kenny, who'll be preaching. We'll have two new world premieres of music by our music fellow Luca, and the second chance to hear Sir James Macmillan's piece composed for the 400th anniversary of the British province. So a real treat awaits us there. And if you're online, you're welcome to join us online for that service. So many thanks to everybody, and hopefully see you at Christchurch very shortly.
Thank you, really.